Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 229, and this is for our class for Monday, September 15th, where we are continuing our introduction to Gothic literature before we begin our first major text, which happens to be Frankenstein. So, if you can see in the notes below, I've indicated some of the topics we'll be talking about today, including past classes. So, as I had indicated previously, I retire each week and then I put it into the past class sessions folder so that you can access that throughout the entire semester. So, what you should have visible on Moodle is this current week. So, if you're looking for our previous week, if you were just to go to the past class sessions folder, you will see that that's where week number 1 now resides. And I'll be keeping that up throughout the course of the semester. And I know you're probably interested in paper topics, even though our first paper isn't going to be due for a bit. So I have posted in our syllabus and other documents folder the paper topics handout. And as I had indicated, I think it's always a good idea to take paper copies of all of the information in the syllabus and other documents folder so that you can easily access it. So I'm going to talk about the paper topics first, and then I'm going to segue into the reading that I had assigned today, which is Supernatural Horror and Literature by H.P. Lovecraft. So if you were to access the paper topics, you'll see that it's the same topic for both papers. You'll remember that your first paper is due approximately midway through the semester. So we've had a good enough time to talk about how to write a paper, and we've also read several Gothic texts. And your second paper will be due at the ending of the semester. And all of you have the opportunity to rewrite at least the first paper for a higher grade. And both papers, paper number 1 and paper number 2, are critical papers, which means that you should not be consulting outside resources. The idea is that you're using your understanding of the text and the learning that's gone on within this particular class. Paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages, but the paper should be as long as it needs to be in order for you to defend your thesis, which is the position upon which you are basing your paper upon. More on that in a moment. And what I've done is I have created a topic, but you can also write on your own topic if you get the topic approved with me beforehand. And the topic has to address one of the texts that we are reading over the course of the semester. So for paper number 1, that would be devoted to one of the texts in the earlier part of the semester, which would probably be Frankenstein, which is our first Gothic text. Poe, because we're going to be reading a sampling of Edgar Allan Poe's short stories, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, the novella that we will be reading after Poe. Paper number 2, which would be due at the ending of the semester, would deal with one of the later works of the semester, which would probably be one of Lovecraft's short stories, The Haunting of Hill House, or The Exorcist. Now, that said, note that I haven't mentioned Dracula because Dracula basically straddles the mid portion of the semester. So you could devote paper number 1 to Dracula if you so wanted, or you could devote paper number 2 to Dracula if you so wanted. But both papers should not be devoted to the same text. So in other words, both papers should not be about Dracula. And the topic that I have selected is one of my favorite quotes from Emily Dickinson. And the quote reads, "One need not be a chamber to be haunted. One need not be a chamber to be haunted." And one of the things we'll talk about in this class are the multiple levels of hauntings that we see in Gothic literature. Many of them are symbolic and allegorical, as we talked about last class. Many of them are psychological, as we will be talking about in the future. So, if you choose the topic that I've selected, you'll examine how that quote by Emily Dickinson applies to the text you have selected for your paper. And again, the options are the earlier text that we will be reading in the first part of the semester, Frankenstein, or Edgar Allan Poe, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, perhaps Dracula. And then the second paper would deal with the later text, perhaps Dracula, or Lovecraft short stories, or The Haunting of Hill House, or The Exorcist. So, regardless of the topic, though, you need to provide textual evidence and details to support your argument. And that's one of the things that we'll be talking about as the semester progresses. One of the reasons why English Comp 2 is a prerequisite for this class, because the assumption is that you've already talked about how to write a literary analysis when you've learned about short story and poetry and drama and perhaps film and creative writing as well. So you are just basically transferring those skills to a specific area, in this particular instance, that happens to be Gothic literature. That said, as the semester progresses, we will be talking more about how to write a paper, albeit it won't be as detailed as what we would talk about, let's say, in a Comp 2 class, because the assumption is that you've already talked about these issues. But I wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page, so to speak. And I've got a note at the bottom of this handout that says a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, quote, have I, or has the author, said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible, unquote. Now, that's a pretty tall order, and I had a very wise professor in college once say that a paper is never done. You just have to hand it in at some point. I think that's quite true. You could spend a lifetime refining and developing your writing, but you don't have a lifetime. And I had selected the mid portion of the semester for paper number 1 because by that point it would be a very good idea to have a grade for your paper. But as I also indicated, I have rolling deadlines. So once I've distributed the paper topic, in other words now, then you have the option of writing and submitting in your paper, which again you could rewrite for a higher grade. I do recommend, however, that you wait until we talk about the text that you are writing your paper on before you submit in your paper to me, because I suspect you will learn things about the text that you will be able to incorporate within your own writing. And certainly you can hand in the paper after the due date, but I'm beginning to get a little bit worried at this point that we're past halfway this semester and that we still don't have a paper grade for you. So you would want to keep me up to date at that particular point in time. And if you'll see on the handout, I tried very hard to utilize all of the conventions with quoting. I used quotation marks when they were appropriate, when I was citing someone else's language, not my own. I use square brackets within the quote to indicate when I'm using somebody else's language, or to indicate when I am inserting my own language into somebody else's language, which is when you use a square bracket. Immediately after the closing quote, I have parentheses, and within the parentheses, I have some information about where that quote can be found. I have the author's last name of that quote, Biddle, and the number 9, which means if you were to refer to the text that he wrote, that if you went to page 9, you would find that particular quote. Of course, you don't know the name of the text, which is why we usually add a works cited page at the ending of our assignments that lists all of that relevant information. And again, we'll talk a little bit more about all of this and what will be relevant or not relevant when you write your paper. I realize it's still quite early in the semester, but my suspicion was that you would want to know sooner rather than later, so you can let this idea of haunting be in the back of your mind, and also think about other possibilities if you don't necessarily like this particular topic as we begin talking about the Gothic text next class. But we're still at our introduction, and last class we talked a little bit about Stephen King and some of his perspectives in Danse Macabre about supernatural literature, as he calls it. And we know that H.P. Lovecraft did the same before King, so obviously King's theories would have been informed by H.P. Lovecraft, a very famous Gothic writer that we will be talking more about as the semester progresses. And perhaps one of the most, if not the most famous essay about the origins, the history, and the definition of Gothic literature was written by H.P. Lovecraft, an essay entitled Supernatural Horror in Literature, which is a longish essay so that it might appear to be a book, but it's really a long essay. And I just wanted to cover some of the points. And if you'll remember, I indicated that Lovecraft's writing style is very different from Stephen King's. Stephen King's is very informal and very colloquial and very accessible. And Lovecraft is the exact opposite. So don't get frustrated with not necessarily being able to easily read Lovecraft's essay. And also don't get frustrated when Lovecraft makes references to texts that you haven't read. I'm really more interested in you getting a general overview of what Lovecraft was saying, how it's similar to and different from what Stephen King was saying in terms of the Gothic tradition. And according to Lovecraft, fear is the oldest and strangest emotion. Now, if you'll remember, Stephen King talked about death. And maybe we're saying the same thing because death comes with fear because it is a great unknown. And Lovecraft talks about the fear associated with the unknown because it's associated with uncertainty and associated with danger. And our oldest and strangest fears begin with our primitive forefathers. So the idea is that this is hardwired into us. It's archetypal, it's genetic. And Lovecraft gives us some definitions. He talks about the macabre. You remember that Stephen King used that title in his own book from last class, that the macabre is that which is gruesome or horrifying or grotesque. And that the weird, at least according in the way that Lovecraft defines it, is supernatural, unearthly, or uncanny. Now, if you've never heard of the term uncanny before, it's a psychological term from Sigmund Freud. There is a close relationship with psychology and the idea of the Gothic tradition. And the uncanny is that which is familiar yet alien at the same time. Something that's very similar to us, but yet there's something that's off. And horror film will oftentimes utilize this in its attempt to scare us. According to Lovecraft, because again, if you think about the time period in which he was writing, that film wouldn't necessarily have been the powerhouse that it is today. We would have had readers engaged in the Gothic tradition. That a reader needs to have imagination, and that's one of the reasons why reading is more difficult than watching film, because you have to basically imagine and envision so much in your own mind. And a detachment from everyday life, that you have to have the ability to suspend disbelief, particularly when you're talking about phenomenon that may not necessarily exist in the natural world. Now, this long essay is divided into chapters, and the first chapter is the introduction. It talks about the incredibly important nature of atmosphere in terms of establishing the Gothic. I had mentioned this a little bit last class, and in fact, some of you mentioned this as well in some of your discussion forum responses about how appropriate it was that this class was being held in the fall, the spooky season, so to speak. And my response is I deliberately offered this class in the fall because of the atmosphere. And if you've ever gone to a Halloween party, you know how important atmosphere happens to be. So this atmosphere of dread. And there's a long literary tradition, as I had also talked about last class, with utilizing supernatural elements. It goes all the way back to, let's say, some of the great epic medieval poems like Beowulf, Beowulf's mother, for instance, or Macbeth, when we talk about the three witches in Shakespeare, or Dr. Faustus, which is actually what I did my graduate work on. Dr. Faustus was written by Christopher Marlowe, a contemporary of Shakespeare's. And in fact, Dr. Faustus is from an old German legend. And the idea is that Faust, or Faustus, is a skilled scholar in multiple disciplines and rather bored with the knowledge that he has, and makes a deal with the devil in order to be able to acquire knowledge that would not be available in the natural realm. Now, that said, you probably already know, spoiler alert, that when you make a deal with the devil, it doesn't go well. So basically, Faustus signs over his soul to the devil after a certain allotment of time so that Faustus can do things that are considered to be supernatural, such as being invisible. And initially, Faustus has these grandiose goals about expending lives extending lifespans and improving humanity. But the way he really spends his time is just engaged in pranks and jokes and nonsense. For instance, at one point he makes himself invisible and he plays a prank on the Pope and during a religious service. And throughout the play, Faustus vacillates about whether or not he should repent. And he continually delays that, justifying it either by the fact that he's so damned because he's made a deal with the devil that there's no point in repenting because he will never be forgiven, or he could be forgiven but he still has time so he can repent in the future. And ultimately, the ending of the play, Faustus has run out of time and the devil is collecting his due. And as Faustus is literally being dragged into hell, at that particular point, Faustus repents. Too little, too late. So what we have here is a morality tale, something that Stephen King talked about. The lesson, don't make a deal with the devil. And in fact, not only did Faustus make a deal with the devil, but the devil really didn't live up to his end of the bargain. When you think about the limited amount of ability Faustus was given in exchange for his soul. But nevertheless, this idea of supernatural elements has existed since perhaps the beginning of literature, but the first Gothic novel, as I talked about, is attributed to Horace Walpole in the 1700s, 1764. The Castle of Otranto, and again in the notes below in the third section, I've included the link for that. It's not a particularly well-written text, but it does establish some of the Gothic conventions, that you're going to have a castle or some sort of a decrepit piece of architecture. Remember the idea that the word Gothic is an architectural term. That basically you will have a villain and usually a persecuted heroine. Gender is quite fascinating in terms of the Gothic tradition. There's a hero who tries to save the day and is usually successful, so there's a restoration of order. There is, of course, that strange atmosphere that I was suggesting, and you'll have fog and trap doors and creaking hinges and strange lights and so forth. And in the 5th chapter of Lovecraft's essay, he talks a little bit about some of the major Gothic texts that developed in the 1800s, including Frankenstein and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And those are two major texts that we are going to be reading over the course of the semester. He devotes an entire chapter to one of his most favorite authors, Edgar Allan Poe, arguing that perhaps Edgar Allan Poe is the most skilled Gothic writer that he can identify, at least up until that particular point of Lovecraft's life, because of Poe's ability to use psychology as well as a standard of realism. And of course, as I had indicated earlier and with our paper topic, psychology is closely tied with the Gothic. And we oftentimes have ambiguity in the Gothic, so that a psychological explanation can oftentimes be substituted for a supernatural explanation, or perhaps both can occur at the same time. Of course, we'll see this more clearly when we actually read some of these texts, such as Poe's short stories. And while we aren't reading many of Poe's short stories, works like The Masque of Red Death and The Fall of the House of Usher, which Lovecraft identifies in his essay, are great examples of Poe's ability to use realism as well as psychology. In chapter 8 of Lovecraft's essay, he talks about the weird tradition. Again, think about the way that Lovecraft uses the word weird to suggest that which is supernatural, unearthly, or uncanny. The weird tradition in American Gothic. The Gothic tradition began in England, but it moved its way to America. Poe being a great example as a New Englander, but you might have heard of other texts, such as Henry James Turner, The Screw, which is a wonderfully subtle and ambiguous ghost story, very much in the tradition of the English ghost story, and Charlotte Perkett Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, which is a short story, which is also a superb example of Gothic, and also a great short story that I would recommend, that utilizes psychology as well as possible supernatural elements. In chapter 9, Lovecraft talks about the weird tradition in the British Isles. So you might have heard of Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. And I can tell you that if I had time in class, we would be reading The Turn of the Screw and we would be reading The Picture of Dorian Gray. It's just a question of time and what is reasonable in the short amount of time that we have. But he also mentions Dracula, and that obviously is one of the major Gothic texts. And in the end, I chose texts that ultimately had such, let's say, cachet in film studies that the film versions are as important, maybe even more important than the written versions. By the way, there is a new version that's supposed to be coming out of Frankenstein by Guillermo del Toro, and I'm very excited about it. It has received standing ovations at its film showings, and it looks like, at least based on the previews that I've seen, it looks like a masterpiece. So I'm quite excited about that. Now, the best horror tales, according to Lovecraft, and of course you can disagree, is that, first of all, they have a sense of naturalness. There's enough reality in there so that we can connect it to our own experiences. It's convincing enough so that it seems like it's a possibility. There's an artistic smoothness about it so that we see a certain level of sophistication when it comes to writing and storytelling. There's a skillful artistry with technique. There's a craftsmanship that's associated with it, that it's more than just, let's say, the story of the Hook, which is meant purely to frighten, but that there is a sense of a facility with language and the ability to be able to, as Stephen King sometimes calls it, to weave a yarn, if you will, that will capture the audience's imagination. The best, according to Lovecraft, uses psychological knowledge and experience within their characterizations, an exotic atmosphere, and some kind of supernatural element. Supernatural being that which defies the natural order, which is in contrast to science fiction, which is something that could be scientifically possible. It just hasn't been discovered yet. And what's interesting about Frankenstein is that it tends to straddle both genres. But again, we talked about how the Gothic oftentimes genre blends with not only science fiction, but sometimes fantasy as well. And our first major text, as we had talked about, will be Frankenstein. And my ideal world scenario is that by next class you would have read Frankenstein in its entirety. Now, I am well aware that we've got multiple classes devoted to Frankenstein because we're going to talk about film as well as ultimately talk about the novel. So you're going to do the best that you can in the time that you have. But I deliberately started slowly so that hopefully you could get to the point where you are close to being finished with Frankenstein if you aren't already, so that as we are talking about Frankenstein over the next 2 weeks, you're reading the next text that's assigned on our course outline. And you're doing that throughout the entire semester. That'll certainly make these class videos and our discussion forum responses make a lot more sense if you've done the reading. But again, as I indicated, I've got multiple classes devoted to Frankenstein, and part of what we need to talk about Frankenstein, or part of what we need to discuss in terms of Frankenstein, is film adaptation, particularly the 1930s iconic Universal Studios version of Frankenstein, but that's our next class. So for our attendance question, which would be due Wednesday on the 17th, and of course, if you need an extension, please let me know and I'll be happy to grant it to you. But as you know, you have 48 hours from the posting of class in order to respond to the attendance question. And it merely is that. It counts as your attendance in effect, and the way it would in a face-to-face class, let's say. You're not required to respond to your peers, just like in a face-to-face class, you're not required to participate, but you're certainly encouraged to. What you are required to is to read all of the peer responses in the class discussion forum and my responses in turn, because I will be responding to all of you. So you'll see that I've responded to all of your introductions, and I am going to be responding to all of your responses about fear And your next response, which will be due Wednesday the 17th, is after everything we've talked about over the last couple of classes, how would you personally define Gothic literature and why? How would you personally define Gothic literature and why? And again, I'm not necessarily looking for a textbook definition. I'm really looking for your own thoughts and ideas here as we begin to delve into the Gothic tradition. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about the papers as the semester progresses, but I wanted you at least to have an idea what the paper topic was. And while certainly you can reference things like Danse Macabre, or you can reference things like supernatural horror and literature in the paper, you are doing an academic analysis of a piece of literature. And the literature really begins with the fictional piece Frankenstein, not necessarily with the commentary that we've been reading thus far about the Gothic tradition. So with that said, I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about Frankenstein. Take care. Bye-bye.